Welcome to the Little Red Podcast, which brings you China from beyond the Beijing Beltway. I'm Graham Smith from the Australian National University's Department of Pacific Affairs, and I'm joined by my co-host, Louisa Lim, former China correspondent for the BBC and NPR, now at the Center for Advancing Journalism at Melbourne University. We're on air thanks to support from the Australian Center on China in the World.
This year, we're looking at beliefs and ideology in Xi Jinping's China. This month, we're turning to Marxism itself. Last year, one phrase that kept surfacing on social media was that China is at the garbage time of history, a phrase that derives from the dying minutes of a basketball game. Here, it means a time of economic despair and political pessimism.
So we thought it time to look at the foundations of Xi's Marxist beliefs. We're so delighted to be joined by two guests today with very different opinions. Alison Sile Chen Zhao, a political analyst who's a PhD candidate at the University of California and the author of Her Battles. We're also joined by Professor Xu Chenggang, a senior research fellow at the Stanford Center on China's Economy and Institutions and the author of Institutional Genes, Origins of China's Institutions and Totalitarianism. So, Alison, you've argued that from an institutional perspective, Marxism no longer exists in China. Could you maybe expand on that? It's a very interesting idea.
Yeah, so it depends on what type of Marxism, what version of it you are thinking about. So if you are talking about a very classic format of Marxism that derived by Marx himself or the peer in that early times, it may not actually exist in China even since, for example, 1949, because it was Leninism and Maoism, or maybe the ideology of Stalin that actually China has followed in terms of its practice of communist, socialist reform, the land reform, property rights reform, those kind of things, including collective labor. However, the real believer of Marxism probably was purged even during the internal struggle of the Chinese Communist Party before they even established the polity of the People's Republic of China as we know today.
What do you think is actually being taught in party schools? It's still called Marxism, and they're doing a lot more time in party schools because of this re-centralization and what you've described, the party being at the center of everything. How would you characterize what grassroots cadres are actually being taught?
Right. Of course, I'm a receiver of that education as well, and until my college years. So I come to the US for master's degree and then PhD education. But before that, all my education are in China. So it's never centralized in Marxism in terms of our political education. So even in college, we have a brief name for this series of political courses. We call it 毛邓三, which means 毛泽东, Deng Xiaoping, and 三个代表, so the three representatives by Jiang Zemin. So at my time, when I was doing college, have not come along of Xi Jinping. And although Hu Jintao was the top leader, but his ideology never really get into the status that his thought can be named align with this Mao Deng-san, Mao Deng, and Jiang Zemin's thoughts. And then right now, actually, Xi Jinping's thoughts or his ideology right now is front and center taught in the political courses. And right now, I saw how they divided the textbook of the political education. Previously, it's like Marxism is not really there in the portion of the book, but Mao Zedong, Deng Xiaoping, and 三个代表, they are kind of 1/3 of the book each of them, and maybe the Deng part is a little bit larger than the other two part. And right now, Mao Zedong, Deng Xiaoping, and San Daibiao are squeezed into maybe just like 1/3 of the book, and the other 2/3 are all on Xi Jinping. So they very much emphasize this like Chinese characteristic of socialism or communism, thus that basically there's no traditional Marxism and socialism anymore.
So, I mean, can you talk a bit about the adaptability of the Communist Party and the way those genes, those institutional genes, have evolved and changed?
Starting from 1949 up to 1957, China basically it becomes a Soviet Union without speaking Russian language and also more backward in terms of the economy. However, the Chinese started the so-called Great Leap Forward in 1958, and there is a huge literature about the Great Leap Forward. And then a few years later, they launched the Cultural Revolution. Again, there is a huge literature about the Cultural Revolution. But here, really the key point is the change of the institution. And that is missing in the huge literature. The change of the institution means that they are not abandoning totalitarianism. What the change is the concrete operation, the way of operating, the way of governing a totalitarian regime is changed. So in Soviet Union, the whole national economy is governed by nearly 100 ministries. And the ministries are going to directly manage all the firms in Soviet Union. So put in another way, the whole economy is managed by emphasizing specialization, because every ministry is specialized in a function. So China was like that up to 1957. But since 1958, there was a huge borrowing their terms, they call that as a decentralization. So there was a huge administrative decentralization. There was no decentralization whatsoever in politics, in personnel, in ideology, in party lines. However, in terms of administration, in terms of resource allocation, there is a huge decentralization. So most of the state assets being delegated to the local authorities. By local, here there are several levels. So you have a provincial, you have a city, you have a county. So then all the counties received lots of assets. And the Cultural Revolution would consolidate this whole arrangement and further decentralized. So after the Cultural Revolution, almost all the Chinese counties became self-contained, self-sufficient, self-contained. That becomes a foundation for the so-called economic reform, because when the starting point of the economic reform was the ending point of the Cultural Revolution. So the whole so-called economic reform is actually facilitated by the inherited institution, which I call that as a regionally administered totalitarianism. So it's regionally administered means that most of the state assets are at the local level. So these are the regions administer these assets. Regions determines administrative matters. Regions decide concretely how to implement the party line, how to fulfill the central authorities' strategic goals. So the party line is highly centralized and is brutal. So if you violate the party line, you'll be punished. You'll be punished severely. So you have to implement the party line. And also, everyone is appointed, and this appointment is completely top-down. So through appointments, through punishments and rewards, so they provide incentives to implement the party line. So the central authorities, they don't have to figure out details. They don't have to figure out how to implement the party line, how to implement the strategy. So what they need to know is to have a strategy, and then they sign an order. They say, you do this, you'll find a way out. If you cannot, you lose your job. That's it. So if everyone is not able to do it, then they have to make adjustment. If someone find their way out, then others are under pressure. So this, we call that as a regional competition. And because the regional authorities are going to find their way out, therefore, this way of managing turns out becomes sometimes quite innovative. And they are much more adaptive, much more resilient than their Soviet counterparts. And that is how the reform being pushed out, and how the private sector being created in China, when the party's ideology is in direct conflict with the private sector, but still the private sector can grow.
Well, one thing that intrigues me is Xi Jinping, even more than any of his predecessors, has written volume after volume of his thought to the point where it almost seems to occupy a larger space than any of his predecessors, more than Deng, more than Mao. What does this effect have on cadres? Like, do they buy into this? Does it change their ideology, or is it still, do you think it's still the same thing?
Yeah, the first important thing here is to understand why he has been doing that. Actually, for a totalitarian regime to work, an important condition is a personality cult. But he didn't. He didn't have that. He wanted in desperate, but he failed and failed again. So the phenomenon you just mentioned actually was for that purpose. So he thought if his thoughts, if his books would fill all the shelves, then he might be able to create his personality cult. But every time when he tried, it became a joke.
I mean, why do you say that it's failed? He has presided over these big ceremonies, you know, his image is everywhere, his words are everywhere. By what metric would you judge it to be a failure and a joke?
Okay. The so-called personality cult means that you have to have a large population who believe it. But in China, you don't have a large population who believe him. So it's a joke means that privately people are joking about his efforts. So not only the commoners make jokes, even the party cadres make jokes of him privately. But of course, they got to be very careful. So when they get caught, they will be punished. Some will be put into prison. So the punishment is very severe. But here, he tried to recreate this personality cult like what Mao had enjoyed, what Deng had enjoyed. But it's just not possible.
So, I mean, do you think that in ideological terms as well, that party ideology is also empty in the same kind of way that people parrot it, but they don't anymore believe it or subscribe to it or even believe that the party believes it?
The party's ideology is not empty. Although his attempted efforts in creating personality cult failed, but the party's ideology is not empty in the sense of the so-called democratic dictatorship is real, and people believe it. And the one-party rule, people believe it. So the majority Chinese believe that China has to be under one-party rule. And the one-party rule implies that the party controls the court, the party controls the police, the party controls the armed forces, party controls everything. People believe it. So that is the ideology. This ideology is at the same time is the reality.
When you were starting your opening, you were talking about two different types of totalitarian regimes, the communist and the fascist regime.
Right.
Given that China is now facing probably its biggest exogenous shock in a long time with the Trump administration and the tariffs, do you think there's any possibility of it flipping to a different sort of regime?
That is exactly my fear. I worry very much of this transformation. And it is actually in the process. And if you look at the Chinese Communist propaganda, you'll find a huge amount of propaganda are in that direction. So I would not surprise at all that fairly soon, when the exogenous shocks are strong enough, they are going to formally change into that type of totalitarianism.
And what signs are you seeing already of that happening?
The reason that's my major fear is because that is connected to war. And by launching a war, they need legitimacy, they need support, they need public support. So even in a totalitarian regime, they always need public support. And this is the easiest way to gain public support.
And when you say a war, do you mean a conventional war, like a conflict with Taiwan or an invasion of Taiwan, or do you mean, would a trade war count as a war?
Okay, so yeah, here I was talking about hot war. So if you regard the trade war as a cold war, so here I'm talking about the hot war. And the hot war, they have been preparing for this. So when you look at their size of Navy, the size of Air Force, the size of the missiles, the reason the size is that large is not coincidental. So because they are preparing for a war. If they launch a war against Taiwan, it's not going to be a local, it's not going to be regional. It's going to be a all-out war. So it's very, very dangerous. Yeah. Also, South China Sea. And if you monitor the sentiments among the Chinese population, you find although privately you have among the Chinese population, you have that many jokes, and almost everyone would make jokes about their top leader. But at the same time, this extreme type of nationalism is very, very popular. So one concrete example is Hong Kong in 2019. So if you watch the mainlanders' sentiment, you find the majority Chinese supported their government in cracking down the demonstrations in Hong Kong. So that's actually that shows how dangerous it is. So if they launch a war against Taiwan, it's not going to be a surprise at all that you have majority support, and the support is going to be very strong.
So actually, these are different systems that the left-leaning progressive thinkers and practitioners versus the people who actually reinterpreting the party line, those kind of things in China. These are just totally different systems. And I'm sometimes uncomforted by the more romantic thinking of the left-leaning thinkers in the free world towards China. The projection, most of the time, I think, are misplaced.
In what sense do you think they're misplaced?
Like too many sense. I mean, like, let's pick an example that I'm most familiar with. For example, gender equality. So it's true that the gender equality actually the very close to Marxist legacy that remain in China, but actually emphasize and through the lens of Maoism. So Mao actually promoted this idea of 妇女能顶半边天, which is the women's holding up half of the skies, right? Actually, this is, I believe, or from my interpretation, come from the idea of classic Marxism that seeing women as equal, fair laborers, or seeing that they also have a place in the workplace, right? From the Maoist standpoint, he just need labor. He need people. He need women to participate in the production of food and steel and all sorts of things. So actually, you see that Mao could use like what is useful from the classic Marxism. However, he transformed it into the situation that the collective labor is that the women and men are just stay in different dormitory, that they cannot enjoy living together as a family unit, and they becomes a collective laborhood, that men are men who live together and go to work, and women are women and they live together and go to work. They become the itemized laborers that are seen as equal, in the sense that actually women's biology situation need to be overlooked and overcome, and you don't dare to talk about you have a period this days and you don't want to get into freezing water, those kind of things. No, you don't get to say about it, and you'll be looked down upon. However, have Mao ever think women should be free from like traditional family responsibility, that they as caretaker, take care of the children, take care of the older, the elderly? No, never. So it's in this Maoist version of Chinese adoption of Marxism, it basically take the part that is useful for it, but actually not going to into the part that it does not want to reform. So in early days, a lot of the female leaders in the party talk about they actually have like three big mountains on their shoulder. Is like the party and the traditional gender role, and also this progressive Marxism view like on them. So they actually taking not just two sides of work, but actually three parts: workplace, family, and also the party's ideology, pushing them towards forgetting their gender identity or their gender specific need, or even emotion, the burden of reproduction. You cannot talk about all those things, but you still need to produce child and also take care of the kids.
I mean, what I'm understanding that you're saying is that this kind of pick and mix attitude towards Marxism that the Chinese Communist Party has taken has become an issue itself, because young people who've been educated in the Marxist tradition understand the hypocrisy of the tasks they're expected to do, and that they don't actually conform to traditional Marxist-Leninist ideals. Is that right?
So it has been transformed, and they almost forgot that this actually comes from the Marxism and Maoist legacy. However, in the very practical way, they understand the conflict and the increase of self-awareness and this awareness of inequality. Actually, I would say is by accident. Like it's an unintentional consequence to a very large extent of the one-child policy. Like one-child policy, when you only have one children, especially in townships and cities and those kind of like state-owned companies, families, when they only have one children, even that's a girl, like what would you do? You will educate her, right? You would not just put her at home and let her become some like future wife. Like you will still educate her. And with this large group of young women, like when getting this education that, oh, I'm the only heir of the family, I'm as valuable as men, and I get all this education, I'm capable, and get into the workplace and realize that no, there are so many discrimination and so many responsibilities still put upon me. And even now, when they dropping the one-child policy, women are expected to give birth to 2 or 3 children, while they are still expected to produce and join the workplace. That is just insurmountable burden. And so with this kind of education and economic productivity, you cannot expect women just accept everything you put on them, right? So there's a lot of historic coincidence and legacy that mix into the gender situation these days that do you ever say is Marxism legacy? I'm not sure. I would say that very specific Chinese characteristic situation come a lot from the Maoist history and the continuation of the Chinese party, while they want all the pragmatic interests instead of really understanding or adopting the ideology like legacy and tradition rationale.
I mean, famously at the moment, both Marxists and feminists are being cracked down upon in China. Are China's feminist intellectuals getting inspiration from Marx?
Okay, let me rethink your question. So why the feminist movement and Marxism are both suppressed in the current China, that's one. And second, whether the feminist activist is borrowing the ideology treasures that from the traditional Marxist ideology. So why they are both repressed? Imagine right now I'm the party. The party right now, or Xi Jinping himself, is saying that Marxism and feminists are both okay, but I'm the only person who can advocate and decide what it actually means, but not you. So it's not the feminist activists who can take their lead, take their empowerment and agency to decide how I mobilize the society, how I interpret gender equality, and how do I see gender policy as fair. No, they don't have this right. It's not really about gender or feminism. I would say is that you are touching the things that the party see as the party's legacy and party's treasury, including ideology legacy. It's not you. So why the democratic dictatorship of people never exists in China? Because those things never belong to the people. It's always the party and the party leaders or the ruler of China or the current China who claim their rights and claim the ownership of those kind of things. And they can use it, they can interpret it, including Xi Jinping. Actually, even at the early days he took power, he actually organized conference among the so-called women's work leaders. So within China, within the CCP, they have this section that specialize in women's work and women's ideology or organizing, mobilizing women, the 中国妇联, right? So what Xi Jinping tell the women works leader to do is that, we should re-embrace the Chinese traditional family value, the virtual, and they all he basically ordered the leaders who actually tune into a lot of the Marxism and Maoism era of ideology legacy to do this kind of renewed form of Chinese traditional family virtue and use it to discipline women and redirect women's energy and power, productivity into the way that the party see fit and the party see useful. So this women's work leaders, they actually need to organize competitions between who are the most beautiful traditional Chinese families. So for them, actually, that is a very touring moment. At that time, I'm actually was at an organization in China, the Feminist Voices, that has some interesting connection with their more traditional or classic women's works leaders in Fulian. So I know they actually feel torn apart. Like why we are going to feels like have a retrogression into the so-called Chinese traditional virtue, which they see as outdated even during the Mao era, right? So that's why I think why both feminists and Marxism are repressed in China, because those legacies from the party's eyes belong to the party. You cannot go and grab them and say that according to this ideology, I believe the policy should look like this and the party is doing not that, right? You don't have the right to do that. That's one part. And the other part actually go back to your very big question about what is the connection. A lot of people are not very familiar with this history, which is extremely interesting that the first very high level international event that held in China was the 1995 World Women Conference, and Hillary Clinton visited China as a preparation for Clinton's visit to China. So Hillary's visit to China in 1995 can be seen as the first official high-level American leadership visiting to China after the Tiananmen massacre. So actually that is an international icebreaker for then China, which is under severe censorship because of the Tiananmen massacre. So actually, that is a very important icebreaker in the sense that Jiang Zemin is standing with Hillary Clinton, seeing very friendly interaction, and Hillary Clinton gave the world-famous speech saying that women's rights are human rights. Like that is the first time that formal recognition of women's rights are human rights in 1995 and in China. So how is that flipping of that image that 10 men standing in front of Tiananmen, right? So actually that is not just image icebreaker. And by the way, Jiang Zemin sees the opportunity to write gender equality, actually not gender equality, is women and men equality into as a basic national policy. So basically they are using this opportunity to responding to Hillary's claim of women's rights are human rights, and also has a very progressive response on the Chinese side, and not just image. That is the first major official recognition of civil society, the existing of civil society in this world. The 1995 World Women's Conference actually give the opportunity for the Chinese government because they need to host this event, they send officials to study what is civil society, because they will have a side conference that actually need to organize all the NGO. So they send female judges, they send female journalists who are actually all, state employee at that time and professionalists. So you suddenly, because of this women event, that you have the opportunity to communicate with the world and learn the most advanced progressive ideology at that time. And that's why the oldest group of NGOs that officially recognized in China are mostly women's rights NGO, are anti-domestic violence network, media monitoring, a network for women, gender equality monitoring. And actually that is one of the earliest organizing of connection between officials and professionals when they actually mostly have some kind of state connection. So besides some very spotty experiments, those NGOs emerged in Beijing after the 1995 conference is the first group of NGOs authorized and recognized and allowed to practice in China. So this is the so-called gender wash. Yes, it basically helped China to break the censorship, but also it gives opportunity for the civil society to grow. It opened a window. It's like, okay, I need to gender wash. So you guys, if you want to do something interesting, whatever, right? So that's the very interesting, delicate connection there.
I guess maybe the question is, does ideology even really matter that much anymore? We have this massive library of Xi Jinping thought. And as you say, people don't necessarily believe it. Western scholars, many of them still can't say, is he a Marxist or not? That is a matter of such debate and discussion. Does ideology matter anymore?
It matters. It's not only matters, it's the core. Because ideology implies the legitimacy of the party rule. So the reason ideology matters is exactly because that is the legitimacy. So when we talk about the war, so why switching the totalitarian party from a communist type back to fascist type is because if they stick with Marxism, then the war is going to be a class war. It's going to be a class fight against the other class. So here in China, the Chinese Communist Party is in deep trouble in their Marxist ideology. So on the one hand, I emphasized on the dictatorship part. So the dictatorship is the legitimacy. So why they are legitimate to control everything, to control the court, control the police, control the armed forces. So this is supported by their ideology, and the ideology is the reality. However, when we talk about the Chinese economy, then the class theory becomes a trouble. Since the Chinese economy relied on private sector. So if they still insist in their class theory, the class struggle theory, they're going to be in deep trouble, since all the entrepreneurs become enemies. And also the employees would want to have their own unions, and the unions would fight against entrepreneurs to protect their own welfare. And indeed, in particular in Peking U and at Tsinghua University, they were students. They were true believers of Marxism, And they organized the societies of Marxism. And they also practiced their Marxism. So then they went to Shenzhen. They organized the employees into unions and had strikes. And then the communists arrest all of them, put them into jail. So here you can see the dilemma, the dilemma facing by the communists. So now they are preparing for wars. But so here they would not label their wars as class wars. So not against the class, but instead against their foreign enemies. So the foreign enemy, against the foreign enemies, the best ideology is the fascism. So it's very natural for them to switch. And they have been doing this for years, for decades, actually. So if you look at in the 1990s, there were many extreme type of nationalistic demonstrations in China. Many of those were very violent. So that's a part of the preparation. So when the time is ready, they are going to make a public announcement. So they change course. Actually, Joseph Stalin already did similar things in the Second World War. So in the Second World War, he relied much more than nationalism than communism. And in the Second World War, Joseph Stalin restored Russian orthodoxy, and he relabeled the Russian orthodoxy as what he called the red orthodoxy.
Thank you so much. That was so interesting.
Alison, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
You've been listening to the Little Red Podcast, bringing you China from beyond the Beijing Beltway. Many thanks to our guests and to my co-host, Louisa Lim. We're on air thanks to support from the Australian Center on China and the World. Our editing is by Andy Hazel, background research by Wing Kwong. Our music is by Susie Wilkins, and our cartoons and GIFs are courtesy of Seb Danta. Bye for now.